by one of my subscribers, Brooke. Her name is Holly BoBo, and it is an interesting and complex case. So let's get into it. Holly Lynn BoBo. She was born October 12th, 1990. Holly lived in Darden, Tennessee. Clint was Holly's older brother, and they lived at home with both of their parents. Holly was really loved by her friends, popular, very kind, was outgoing, and had a great future ahead of her. Holly was a devout Christian. Holly went to church regularly, and she was extremely close to her mother, Karen, that was an elementary school teacher in the town they lived. Holly was also an amazing singer. She had a cousin, Whitney Duncan, that was a famous country singer. Right before her disappearance, Holly was ready to become a nurse, and life was really good. Holly and her boyfriend, Drew Scott, were also looking forward to their future together. All that would change on April 13th, 2011, when Holly was abducted from her home. The day started off as every other day. She woke up early around 4:30 that day because she had to study for an exam, and this was not out of the ordinary for Holly to do. She took her studying and school very serious. Karen had packed her a lunch that day before heading off to work. Holly's father also left for work around the same time Karen did. Both of her parents stated when they left for work, she was at the table studying, and nothing was out of the ordinary. Only Holly and Clint were in their house. Her brother Clint was still asleep. It was only 7:30 a.m. Holly received a phone call from her boyfriend Drew. This would be Holly BoBo's last phone call. Holly had reached out to a fellow nursing student. To both people that spoke with Holly, they stated she was fine. There was no distress in her voice. Everything was normal with the phone call. After speaking with her nursing friend on the phone, she got her stuff in her black Ford Mustang. Her car was in the carport next to their home. Now this is when things begin to get completely sketchy. As Holly was walking to her car, a neighbor said they heard Holly screaming, "Stop it." The neighbor had heard her scream multiple times. "Stop it." Multiple. Clint, her brother, is still sleeping in his room and did not hear any screams at this time, even though his room wasn't too far from the carport. At 7:46, Karen received a phone call from the worried neighbor at work. At 7:50, Clint woke to the barking dog that they had in their home. Clint still did not hear Holly screaming. He just saw that their dog was barking frantically and knew something was not right. Clint had stated he heard a woman and a man talking. Clint immediately knew the female voice was his sister's Holly. He assumed it was her boyfriend Drew. Clint said when he looked through the blinds, he saw a man in all camouflage, and the two were kneeling, looking at each other. Due to the tone of the convo, he assumed they were just arguing. Again, he thought it was just Holly's boyfriend. Clint did not want to go out there while they were arguing and interrupt their convo. He thought they were possibly breaking up. Clint stated he could make out in the conversation Holly stating no why. Mom called the house directly after the neighbor had contacted her at work. Clint told his mom what he was seeing and asked his mom if Holly was planning on going to school that day, or was she planning on hanging out with Drew. Karen began to panic because she knew Holly had an exam She was studying there in the morning and she would not miss it. She takes her studies very seriously. She also knew Drew was at their family's property and no way was Drew there in the carport with Holly. Karen immediately told Clint to get a gun and shoot him. Clint was still very perplexed on all what was going on. He had just woken up and was still groggy. Clint stated to his mom that he thought that was Drew Holly was speaking to and asked his mom again, "You want me to shoot Drew?" Karen immediately hangs up and calls 911. Clint then looks out the blinds again and sees him and Holly walking towards the woods behind their house. Now that the man was standing, he immediately knew it was not Drew because the man was a lot larger than Drew. Clint stated Holly was walking unassisted. The man was behind her and holding a big black object. Clint immediately tried calling Holly's cell phone and then calling Drew's. The calls were unsuccessful. Neither answered. Karen called the home again and Clint told her what he had saw. Karen interrupted Clint and said, "Call 911 now." By this point, Clint loaded his pistol. He went to the carport. He then saw about 60 spots of Holly's blood. He immediately called 911. The police arrived at the residence, and then BoBo's arrived shortly thereafter. Clint was able to give a description of the man that he saw with his sister. The description of the man was he was 5'10" to 6 feet tall, weighed about 190 to 200 pounds, and the man had dark hair. The man was in camouflage and had a hat on. Seeing his face was impossible. After the abduction, a search team began to form around the BoBo's property and surrounding area. Police, volunteers, and search dogs were brought to the scene. Helicopters and ATVs were brought in, others using horseback. Holly's father immediately suspected the man had to have known the area and possibly Holly's schedule. The police immediately turned to Holly's cell phone. Holly's cell phone was not in her car, and they believed it was on her. Holly's phone pinged at 8:17 a.m., heading north near Highway 40. At 8:30 a.m. to 9 a.m., her cell phone stopped moving. Then at 9 a.m., started to head down south in the opposite direction on another road. Considering how fast the phone was moving, it was clear she was in a vehicle. Police began searching these routes in the surrounding areas. In the weeks after her disappearance, they found multiple items belonging to Holly. They were strung along old back roads. Some of these items were her notebook, homework, and her lunch that her mom made for her the day she went missing. Her SIM card and her cell phone were located, but the SIM card was removed from the cell phone. Shortly after the searches turned cold, the law enforcement started looking at her brother, Clint, considering Clint was the last to have seen her. Clint claimed his innocence, and the police were able to rule him out as a suspect. Also, early on in the investigation, four men attracted law enforcement's attention. They were brothers, Zach and Dylan Adams, and their cousins, Shane Austin and Jason Autry. At the time, they did not have anything linking them to the disappearance of Holly BoBo. Please remember those names, as they will be important here coming up. Law enforcement then turned to Terry Britt. Terry was a registered sex offender in the area. Mr. Britt matched the description Clint gave to the investigators on this case. TBI agent Terry Dykes strongly believed Terry was the one responsible for Holly BoBo's abduction. According to Agent Dykes, Terry had a specific type he preyed on, and it was a young, blonde, blue-eyed girls, which obviously Holly hit every one of those boxes. That Mr. Britt would more than likely have something to do with this. When Mr. Britt was questioned about what he was doing on the day Holly was abducted, he stated he and his wife were buying a bathtub in town at a salvage yard. When law enforcement looked into this, they did not have any record of Mr. Britt buying anything that day. Mr. Britt's home is north of the BoBo's residence. Holly's phone pinged in his area that day when law enforcement searched Mr. Britt's residence with cadaver dogs and bugged his house. Law enforcement still came up empty-handed. When Agent Dykes interviewed Terry about Holly's disappearance, Terry said something that threw up a red flag. Terry went into explaining what the kidnapper would have felt like kidnapping Holly. It seemed a little creepy, like he was playing out in his head how he would have done it and felt. Ugh. Agent Dykes thought he was reliving it and that he had been the one that abducted Holly. Terry Britt continued to claim his innocence, and law enforcement was not able to pin this on Mr. Britt. Agent Dykes refused to move on to other suspects. He strongly felt Mr. Terry Britt was their suspect. Terry Dykes was removed from this case. To this day, Agent Dykes still believes Mr. Britt still had something to do with Holly Bobo's disappearance. At this point in the investigation, it turned cold. It hit an absolute dead end. Multiple tips came in. One saying she was being held against her will in a home. One came in, held against her will in a barn. And then someone had said she had been thrown down a well. None of the multiple leads led law enforcement anywhere. However, though, March 2014, there were finally multiple breaks in this case. Attention shifted back to the four men I mentioned earlier and told y'all to remember. Brothers Zach and Dylan Adams and cousins Shane Austin and Jason Autry. These four were best friends and well known to law enforcement as criminals. What initially attracted law enforcement to these men was Zach Adams. He was going around town talking about Holly's disappearance. As sick as it is, he was taking credit for her murder, bragging about it. The other three were said similar things about the case as well. Okay, this is where things become really sketchy and perplexing. In this case, police already had Dylan Adams, Zach's younger brother, in custody on an unrelated charge of weapons. Since Zach had been bragging about Holly's disappearance and that he did it, investigators then began to question Dylan about it. Dylan Adams was the youngest out of the four best friends. Adams' mother stated that he had intellectual disabilities. Dylan confessed to law enforcement that all four of the Jason Autry, Shane Austin, and his brother Zach Adams all were responsible for Holly's disappearance. Dylan had also disclosed that all four of the men assaulted her at Zach's residence. Dylan also disclosed to law enforcement that Zach video recorded all of it. But he really didn't give specific details about Holly's abduction. And when they asked him who killed Holly, his story changed. At first, he told law enforcement Zach killed her. But then, in a blink of an eye, he stated Jason is the one that killed Holly. Of the puzzle together. However, since Dylan's story kept changing, they knew he would not be a reliable witness. That's when they turned elsewhere. They turned to cousin Shane Austen. They offered Mr. Austen immunity in exchange for his testimony. Mr. Austen agreed to cooperate with authorities. However, there was one small problem with that. He couldn't give information on Holly's abduction, and either couldn't or wouldn't state where Holly's body was. Due to this, law enforcement threatened to take immunity off of the table. Austen's lawyers had a huge battle with them over this. Despite the inconsistencies and the men not being able to give specific details about the abduction or where Holly's body was, law enforcement and the grand jury felt they still had a strong enough case to move forward. March 5th, 2014, investigators held a press conference. They announced they had charged Zach Adams with felony first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping of Holly BoBo. Shortly after that, on April 29th, Jason Autry was indicted on the same charges. Now, to the public, this came out of nowhere. At this point, they had not even found Holly's remains. The case took another unexpected turn when the police arrested 2 more in connection with Holly BoBo's abduction. Brothers Jeff and Mark Piercy were charged tampering with evidence and accessory after the fact. Another woman came forward, Sandra King, and said she was roommates with Jeff Piercy. Sometime in May, Jeff had showed Sandra a video of Holly BoBo tied up and crying. According to Sandra, on the same video, Holly was sexually assaulted by Zach. Who watches this and says nothing, right? Then Sandra retracted, saying that she saw Holly tied up and crying, but did not see the sexual assault. And the only reason Jeff had the video was because his brother Mark gave it to him. Mark is the one who actually filmed it. Law enforcement recovered 20 phones, but couldn't find it on any of them. The Piercy brothers denied knowing the other men and maintained their innocence. Investigators continued to build their case around these 6 men, even though they didn't know where Holly really was at that point. This would change several months later when 2 men were hunting about 20 miles outside of Darden. One of the men that saw the remains said there was a bucket close by that was turned upside down. To this day, it has not been disclosed what exactly was under the bucket. Some can only speculate. One man stated what he saw in the bucket made him physically ill, but it cannot be confirmed by law enforcement. When officers arrived on scene, they are able to recover a skull with a bullet hole in the back of the head. They also recovered teeth, ribs, and a shoulder blade. They would later be identified as Holly BoBo's. Holly's remains were found in the same area her phone was pinging the day of her abduction. This was approximately 6 miles away from Zach's home. Yes, I'm counting the 6s in this story. On September 17, 2014, Dylan Adams was officially charged in the case. The charges in Dylan's case changed quite a few times throughout the entire process. The list is too long for me to read off to you. The consistent charge that was always there was rape. When the police could not find video that Piercy's brother supposedly filmed, the charges were dropped and they were never mentioned again in the case. Law enforcement was still convinced that the Piercy brothers had something to do with this. As the case got closer, the case took another roller coaster ride. February 2015, Shane Austen was found dead in Bartlow, Florida. At the time, Shane was not a suspect in the crime, but was a key eyewitness. For the next 2 years, the police were going back and forth with all of these men's attorneys. Early 2017, Jason Autry was going to testify against his cousin, Zach, for leniency. By this time, the police were missing something seriously crucial for the case, and that was the murder weapon. They knew a gun had been used in Holly's death, but could not locate it. But that changed right before the trial was set to start. A pistol that was supposedly owned by Shane Austin was now deceased. The gun was found under a water in a drainage ditch. Law enforcement believed this was the murder weapon and would go on to present this in the trial. And I will come back to this in a bit. The trial of Zach Adams began on September 2017. The prosecution's case was largely circumstantial. They had no DNA, no other forensic evidence that they could tie to Zach to the crime. They were heavily relying on Jason Autry's account of that day. Autry's story was vastly different than the one Dylan told law enforcement. Jason gave a graphic account of what happened that day. Jason said that day, Holly's abduction, he was in need of drugs. He was withdrawing and was looking any which way he could to get drugs. This is when he got in touch with Zach Adams. When he spoke with Zach, he asked Jason to help him with a problem that he had. He assumed Jason needed him to help him make a batch of meth, because that's normal. He then went over to Shane Austin's house, where he said he saw Zach, Dylan, and Shane walking around, and that there was a fire burning in a burn barrel. He said they were throwing things in the burn barrel. He said he had no idea what was all thrown in the burn barrel, though. Okay, so Jason said to law enforcement that he saw the body, and he thought it was someone they had a dispute with prior. So my question leads me to thinking, okay, so if they're arguing with people, they just kill them? Or if it's over money and meth, then they just kill them? Have these men killed previously? That's what that leads me to believe. But no, Zach stated, no, that's Holly BoBo. Disclosed it right there to Jason. Jason stated at that time he had no clue who she was at all. Zach asked Jason to help him dispose of the body, and at that time, Holly was already wrapped in a blanket and already in the back of the truck. He stated the whole time he never looked inside the blanket. It was at the time when they drove off to dispose of Holly's remains. Then Jason noticed they had zero tools. He asked Zach, "What is the plan? Are we burying her? What are we doing?" Jason then thought quick and came up with another plan. Hey, we should gut Holly and she'll sink to the bottom of the river, and then the turtles can finish the job. He said he then drove to Birdsong Road near a boat dock, then backed up to a pile of riprap about 20 to 30 feet away from the I-40 bridge. This time, Jason said he was standing over Holly's body when he saw her feet move and legs move. Jason told Zach he needed to take care of it. Jason said he quickly ran up to make sure the coast was clear. He said at this time, Zach took the out of the glove compartment and shot Holly BoBo in the back of the head. At this point, both men were scared. Someone heard the gunshots or possibly saw them. So they hurried and put Holly back into the truck and left. Jason said he and Zach met up about 2 hours later And I really don't know what happened in between those 2 hours. But when they met back up, that's when Jason found out about the three men abducting Holly and raping her. He said that Zach disclosed that he had sexual relations with his brother right before it happened. Gross. It was at this time Zach told Jason he had disposed of Holly's body. Shortly after this, Zach asked Jason to kill his brother Dylan because he was unable to keep his mouth shut. Jason agreed, took Dylan on a boating trip. He was planning on killing him there on the boating trip that they went on, but abandoned his plan when one of Dylan's acquaintances ran into them. When prosecution asked Dylan how they even knew Holly, Jason said Zach had some sexual relationship with Holly's cousin Natalie. Zach stated that Natalie talked about Holly and suggested that they have a threesome. Jason stated that the day of the abduction, the men were over at the BoBo's residence to meet Clint, not to kidnap Holly. Supposedly, they were over at their residence to teach Clint how to make meth. Because this story sounds legit. Supposedly, Holly saw this and started screaming, and this is why they took her into the woods. In the trial, Clint denied this, stated he didn't even know the men. Jason ended his testimony and stated he told the truth. He hoped for leniency, that he did feel remorse. He stated he did not have anything to do with the actual abduction or sexual assault or the murder of Holly BoBo. The prosecution presented the gun that was supposedly used to kill Holly BoBo. According to a man that did testify at the trial, Shane Austin and Jason Autry had sold the gun to him for drugs. They ended up bringing in an expert to the trial. The expert said the weapon could have been the murder weapon. Prosecution also alleged that Shane Austin was the one that Clint BoBo had seen walking into the woods with his sister Holly that day. They said this is because of the description that Clint gave, it matched Shane Austin. They also pointed out pieces of paper that belonged to Holly, a receipt and a note card, and it was 75 feet away from Shane Austin's home. Prosecution also relied on Zach's ex-girlfriend Rebecca Erbs. She stated that Zach told her in an argument that he was going to tie her up like Holly BoBo and no one would ever see her again. The defense claimed that there was no physical evidence that tied Zach and Holly together. They also pointed out to the phone records that proved that Zach and Holly were in different locations after Holly's abduction. They actually brought up Terry Britt again, stating he could be the one that killed her because he was a convicted kidnapper and rapist. The prosecution also pointed out that the cadaver dogs alerted to several things on his property. One thing that was consistent in this trial was how brutal and graphic the murder was. In between the prosecution and the defense was BoBo's family. Karen, Holly's mom, was asked to identify some of Holly's belongings that were located in the woods. Karen began to cry uncontrollably and actually passed out while on the witness stand. They had to listen to everything, every detail of what happened to their daughter. The prosecution finally rested, and the rest was in the jury's hands. On September 22nd, 2017, the jury found Zach Adams guilty on all charges. The next day, on September 23rd, he was sentenced to life without parole and 2 consecutive terms of 25 years for both the kidnapping and rape convictions. To this day, Zach maintains his innocence and is appealing his conviction. On January 18th, 2018, Dylan Adams pled guilty to facilitating a first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. Dylan was sentenced to 35 years without parole. Dylan also gave up his right to appeal. Jason Autry, however, is at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison. The state is concerned that if the case is reversed, there's a strong likelihood that they'll need him again. Jennifer Thompson, Zach's attorney, said she is still awaiting transcripts from the trial so she can formally file her appeals on the case. So in a nutshell, what does this all mean? No one knows if an appeal will be granted, but Autry, who many once thought might get a sweetheart plea deal, needs to get comfortable behind bars. Even a year later, it doesn't look like he'll be getting out any time soon.